She stood by the window, her hands trembling slightly as the evening light washed over her tired face. Margaret, Maggie Carter, a 58-year-old widow who had given up everything to raise her only son, heard the words no mother should ever hear. "Mom, you're not coming to my wedding. You'll ruin it." The silence that followed was deafening. For Ethan, those words were nothing more than a decision to protect his image, but for Maggie, it was the moment her heart cracked, and the moment she chose to change his life forever. This is not just a story about a wedding or a broken family bond. It is about sacrifice unrecognized, love taken for granted, and a storm of truth that no luxury or title could ever withstand. From the quiet streets of Savannah, Georgia, to the glittering beaches of Palm Beach and the chaos of a Hawaiian honeymoon gone wrong, this journey will reveal what happens when a son forgets the very foundation of his success. Stay with us, because what Maggie does next will not only shock you, but it will leave you questioning what is the true measure of wealth, money or a mother's love. Savannah, Georgia, a quiet coastal town where the streets are lined with oak trees draped in Spanish moss, and the salty wind carries both comfort and loneliness. In a weathered wooden house at the edge of town lived Margaret Maggie Carter. Her life was not one of luxury or recognition. Instead, it was built on sacrifice, day after day, year after year. Her husband had passed far too soon, leaving her with nothing but a small house and a young boy with eyes full of promise. From that moment on, Maggie decided that no matter how heavy the burden, she would carry it. She became a seamstress by day, pie seller by night, and sometimes both at once. If there was a shift to cover, Maggie was there. If there was a penny to save, Maggie saved it. Her neighbors often wondered how she did it. But behind every worn-out apron, behind every sleepless night, was a dream. Her son, Ethan. She wanted him to walk into classrooms she herself could never afford, to read books she had never touched, to step onto stages she would only see from the shadows. Every choice she made, every blister on her hands, was for him. When Ethan was old enough for school, Maggie tightened her belt even more. She paid for uniforms, tutors, and school trips she could barely afford. Later, when he was accepted into a private academy, she worked double shifts at the diner, often coming home with her feet swollen, collapsing into bed for only a few hours before doing it all over again. And when Ethan received the letter of acceptance to study in Boston, Maggie cried in silence. They were not tears of worry, but of pride. She knew it meant even more sacrifices ahead, but it also meant the world she had dreamed of for him was opening. The old wooden house held the echoes of these years, the hum of her sewing machine at midnight, the smell of pies cooling on the counter before dawn, the faint sound of her prayers whispered into the dark. Savannah itself bore witness to her devotion, and though she never spoke of her struggles, those close to her could see it in her eyes, the mixture of exhaustion and unshakable love. To Ethan, these sacrifices seemed invisible, like the air he breathed, but to Maggie they were the very essence of motherhood. She believed that if she built her son's future strong enough, nothing could break it. She had no idea that one day he would look at her not as the foundation of his life, but as a flaw in his perfect image. Years passed, and the little boy Maggie once carried on her back returned to Savannah as a man. Ethan Carter was no longer the child who clung to her skirts. He had become polished, confident, and successful. With a degree from Boston and years of climbing the corporate ladder, he now held the position of marketing director at a luxury travel company. His suits were tailored, his shoes shined, and his smile carried the weight of someone who knew he had made it. For Maggie, seeing him step out of the sleek black car that pulled up in front of her old wooden house was like watching a dream materialize. The boy she once tucked into bed with threadbare blankets now looked like he belonged to a world she had only glimpsed through glossy magazines. Pride swelled in her chest, mixed with something quieter, almost uncertain. Ethan did not come alone. At his side was Isabella Monroe, known simply as Bella. Her name carried weight in Florida, where her family owned properties and held influence in high circles. Bella was everything the magazine celebrated. She was elegant, tall, with a beauty that seemed untouchable. Dressed in a pale silk dress, she moved with the confidence of someone who had never worried about bills or sleepless nights. Ethan introduced her with a voice full of pride. "Mom, this is Bella. We are engaged." The words echoed in her heart. She forced a smile, whispering her congratulations, though her hands trembled as she reached out to greet the young woman. Bella's handshake was delicate but cool, her eyes scanning the small living room with curiosity that felt more like judgment. The faded curtains, the worn furniture polished with years of care, the scent of pies Maggie had baked earlier in the day, none of it seemed to impress her. Still, Maggie held her warmth, determined to welcome the woman her son loved. That evening they sat together at the table Maggie had cherished since her marriage. The pie sat untouched by Bella, who lifted her glass of water with elegant precision. Ethan spoke about the future with excitement, about the wedding to be held in Palm Beach, about the guest list filled with names Maggie had never heard of, about a life that seemed further away from Savannah than the stars themselves.
As Maggie listened, she tried to hide the ache in her chest. She knew this was the life she had built for him, the life she had prayed for. Yet, somewhere deep inside, she wondered if in building his dream, she had lost her place within it. The next afternoon, Maggie prepared her small home as best as she could. She laid out her finest tablecloth, polished the old wooden chairs, and baked the pie recipe Ethan had always loved since he was a boy. She wanted everything to feel warm, welcoming, and full of the love she had poured into this house for decades. When the knock finally came, her heart beat a little faster. Bella entered first. She wore a flowing white silk dress that shimmered in the afternoon light, the kind of dress Maggie had only ever seen in shop windows. Round her neck hung a delicate gold chain, and her perfume filled the room with a sharp floral scent. She moved gracefully, but with an air of distance, as if each step she took through the modest living room created more space between her world and Maggie's. Ethan followed, carrying a polished leather bag. His eyes darted proudly toward Bella, then back to his mother, as though he hoped the two would blend into one picture. Maggie offered her warmest smile, though her voice quivered when she said, "Welcome to my home." Bella's eyes lingered on the faded curtains, the patched-up rug, the old photos of Ethan displayed proudly on the wall. There was no malice in her expression, but there was no warmth either. She accepted Maggie's handshake lightly, her fingers cool and detached. When Maggie leaned forward to offer a motherly embrace, Bella tilted politely, but did not lean in. The room filled with the soft sound of Maggie's sigh, quickly hidden beneath her steady composure. They sat together, but the distance remained. Maggie served her pie, placing the slices with care. Ethan reached for his plate eagerly, but Bella only pushed her slightly aside, lifting her glass of water instead. The air carried the fragrance of Bella's perfume, overpowering the simple aroma of baked apples and cinnamon. Maggie tried to bridge the silence with small talk, asking about Bella's family, her work, her dreams. Bella answered politely but briefly, her words practiced and measured. She asked little about Maggie, as though the conversation was an obligation rather than a connection. Ethan, caught between them, laughed too loudly at small remarks, trying to smooth away the tension that sat heavy on the room. For Maggie, the evening was bittersweet. She wanted to see the joy in her son's eyes, and it was there, yet she also felt something missing, a warmth, an embrace, the kind of bond she had always dreamed her son would share with his future wife. In the quiet moments, as Bella's perfume lingered in the air, Maggie realized that though they sat in the same room, their worlds were still oceans apart. The next morning, Maggie invited Ethan and Bella to sit for tea in her small but carefully kept living room. She brought out her best china, the same set she had once saved for church gatherings and rare holidays. Her hands shook slightly as she poured the tea, but her voice remained steady. She wanted this to be a moment of connection, a chance to prove that love and family mattered more than appearances.
Bella crossed her legs gracefully, her white dress falling perfectly in place. She looked around the room again, her eyes pausing on the faded photographs of Ethan as a child. Her lips curved into a polite smile, but it did not reach her eyes. Taking a slow sip of tea, she placed the cup back down and spoke with calm certainty. She explained that their wedding would be held at Palm Beach, in a private resort filled with elegance and prestige. Then her tone shifted ever so slightly, becoming sharper. She said the wedding was not just about love, but about image. Guests would come from families of influence, and the atmosphere had to be flawless. Maggie sat still, trying to follow Bella's words. The bride-to-be's gaze settled on her at last, and she spoke without hesitation. This event has to represent who we are, the kind of life Ethan and I are building. Your presence, though important in a personal sense, may not align with the impression we want to give. Maggie's breath caught in her throat, but before she could respond, Ethan leaned forward. His eyes darted between Bella and his mother, and then, with a voice that cut sharper than any storm, he said, "Mom, it's better if you don't come." The words hung in the air, heavy and unmovable. Maggie felt them strike deeper than any wound she had ever known. She had endured nights without sleep, years of sacrifice, storms that nearly stole her life, but nothing prepared her for this. She looked at her son, her only child, and for the first time she did not recognize him. Silence followed. Bella adjusted her dress, sipping her tea, as if nothing more needed to be said. Ethan leaned back, avoiding his mother's eyes, as though ashamed of the truth he had just spoken. Maggie folded her hands in her lap, forcing herself to nod gently. She did not argue, did not beg, did not cry. Her eyes carried the weight of heartbreak, but her voice was calm. "I understand." But inside, at that very moment, Maggie made a decision. She would not fight their rejection with words. She would answer it with actions. And those actions would change Ethan's life forever. That night, Maggie lay awake in her narrow bed, staring at the wooden beams of the ceiling she had stared at for decades. The words of her son echoed over and over, each repetition cutting deeper into her heart. She remembered Ethan's first steps across this same wooden floor, the nights she held him close when storms rattled the windows, the years she worked until her fingers bled just to keep food on the table. And now, after everything, he had told her she would ruin his wedding. By dawn, her tears had dried and her resolve had hardened. She rose quietly, tied her worn shawl around her shoulders, and walked to the small desk where she kept her bills and records. Her hands moved with steady determination as she opened the folders that had always carried Ethan's name. The joint account she had kept for his safety, the credit card she had quietly paid off when he overspent, the rent for the apartment in Miami that she had covered month after month without his knowledge. One by one, she began to close the doors he had never realized she had held open.
She called the bank first. Her voice was calm, polite, but unwavering as she instructed the teller to shut down the shared account. She cut through the credit card statements with scissors and placed them neatly into the trash. By noon, she had spoken with the landlord of Ethan's Miami apartment, informing him that she would no longer be responsible for the payments. The man on the other end sounded surprised, but Maggie's tone carried no hesitation. Every decision felt like a quiet storm rolling through her chest. There was no anger, no revenge, only the knowledge that Ethan had chosen to sever the bond between them in the most public and painful way. And if he wished to build a life separate from her, then she would step back and let him, but not without showing him the reality of what that life would cost. That evening, as the sun dipped low over Savannah, Maggie sat alone at her kitchen table. The pie dish from the day before was still there, a single slice untouched. She pushed it aside, folded her hands, and whispered softly, "If he must learn, then let him learn." It was not bitterness that filled her heart, but a kind of aching strength. She had carried Ethan through storms before. Now she would let him face the storm of his own choices. The following morning, Maggie put on her best coat, the one she usually saved for Sunday service, and made her way into town. The air was crisp, the streets quiet, but her mind was steady with purpose. She walked into the office of Mr. Whitaker, the family lawyer who had known her since Ethan was a boy. He rose from behind his desk, surprised to see her at this early hour, but the determination in her eyes silenced any questions. Maggie sat across from him and explained with calm precision what she wanted. She no longer wished for her estate to go to Ethan. Instead, every penny, every piece of property, and every savings bond would be redirected to the Coastal Relief Foundation, a fund dedicated to families who lost everything to hurricanes. Mr. Whitaker hesitated for a moment, studying her face. He knew this was not a decision made in haste. Slowly he nodded and began to prepare the paperwork. As he slid the documents toward her, his eyes softened. "Are you sure about this, Maggie?" he asked. She placed her weathered hand over the pen and replied, "My son has forgotten where he came from. Maybe one day he will remember, but until then, others need this more than he does." The ink dried under her signature, final and unshakable. With that stroke of the pen, she rewrote not just her will, but the course of her son's future. On her way home, her thoughts drifted to a night many years ago, when the wind had howled like a beast outside their small wooden house. Ethan had been just a boy, barely 10, when a Category 4 storm slammed against Savannah. The roof cracked, windows shattered, and water surged under the door like a hungry tide. She had thrown her body against the door, pressing with all her strength as waves battered from the outside. Her back burned, her muscles screamed, but she did not move. She used herself as a shield so her son could crawl to safety in the loft.
When the storm finally passed, her body was bruised and bleeding, her back scarred with a jagged mark that she carried for the rest of her life. Ethan never forgot that night, or at least, she thought he hadn't. That scar was her Medal of Honor, proof of the night she gave everything to keep her son alive. Now, as she walked the quiet streets, she touched her side where the scar still burned faintly with memory. She whispered to herself, "Love is not measured in what we give to be seen. It is measured in what we give when no one is looking." And with that, she knew. The storm that was coming for Ethan would not be one of wind and rain, but of truth and consequence. Palm Beach shimmered under the Florida sun as guests began arriving at the Monroe estate. Rows of white roses lined the aisle, crystal chandeliers swayed above the grand tent, and a string quartet played delicate notes that floated across the manicured lawns. To the outside world, it was a wedding pulled from the pages of a luxury magazine. But beneath the glamour, there was a quiet absence, a missing piece that no one mentioned aloud. Ethan stood at the altar, his tuxedo tailored to perfection, every detail of the ceremony crafted to fit the image he and Bella wanted to project. Cameras flashed, friends from his corporate circle smiled politely, and Bella's family mingled with wealthy socialites. Yet in the back of Ethan's mind, a shadow lingered. The seat where his mother should have been sat empty, tucked at the far corner of the tent. He had told himself her presence would have ruined the image. But now, staring at that vacant chair, a knot formed in his chest that he could not explain away. Bella floated down the aisle in a gown that glittered like starlight, her expression poised and flawless. She smiled at Ethan, but her eyes flicked briefly to the guests, checking, measuring, making sure everything was as perfect as she demanded. The vows were spoken, the rings exchanged, and applause erupted as they sealed the marriage with a kiss. To the crowd, it was a triumph, a union of elegance and prestige. The reception unfolded with champagne towers and gourmet dishes flown in from Paris. Laughter echoed, glasses clinked, and the couple danced under the lights. Ethan tried to lose himself in the celebration, but with every toast, with every song, the absence of one gentle, weathered voice grew heavier. He looked around at the hundreds of faces, yet none of them carried the quiet warmth of the woman who had raised him. Still, the night went on, and Ethan drowned his unease in fine wine and polite smiles. Guests congratulated him. Bella's parents glowed with pride, and the photographers captured every angle of the grand affair. For a moment, it seemed the choice had been worth it. The world saw him as polished, successful, and finally part of the Monroe Circle. But storms have a way of arriving when skies seem the clearest, and as Ethan and Bella departed for their honeymoon in Hawaii, hand in hand, neither of them knew that the first cracks in their perfect image were waiting just around the corner.
The sun dipped low over the turquoise waters of Hawaii as Ethan and Bella checked into their oceanfront resort. The air smelled of salt and orchids, the lobby gleamed with polished marble, and staff greeted them with leis and chilled champagne. Everything about the place screamed luxury, the kind of setting Bella had dreamed of sharing across her social media, a stage for the perfect beginning. Ethan smiled, relieved that the stress of the wedding was behind them, convinced that now he could simply enjoy the fruits of his success. But perfection has a way of cracking at the smallest pressure. When Ethan handed over his black card at the front desk, the clerk's polite smile faltered. He tried again, swiping a second time, then a third. Still declined. Ethan chuckled nervously, brushing it off as a mistake, but the whispers of guests nearby started to sting. Bella's face tightened as the clerk leaned in, apologizing quietly that the hotel could not process the payment. Embarrassed, Ethan pulled out another card, only for that one to fail as well. Bella's cheeks flushed crimson, not from love, but humiliation. The manager was called over, his voice low yet firm. "Sir, perhaps you should contact your bank. For now, we'll need a working form of payment." Ethan fumbled, his confidence unraveling. He had always assumed the safety net was endless, that his mother's support would never run dry. Now, at the very moment he wanted to impress, the ground beneath him gave way. The lobby's grandeur turned into a stage of shame. Bella avoided eye contact with the staff, her nails digging into Ethan's arm as she hissed,
What is going on? Around them, other couples checked in effortlessly, wheeling designer luggage past, while the Carters stood frozen in disbelief. Finally, Bella's father, who had accompanied them to ensure everything ran smoothly, stepped forward with his card, rescuing the scene but leaving an unspoken scar. Dinner that evening was quiet, the sparkle of champagne gone flat. Bella scrolled through her phone, ignoring Ethan's attempts at small talk. The glamorous honeymoon photos she had planned never made it online. Instead, she replayed the humiliation in her mind, her pride cracking like glass. Ethan sat across from her, sweat forming at his temples, wondering for the first time what had truly changed back in Savannah. What he did not know was that Maggie's silence had been her decision, her final lesson, wrapped not in words, but in action. And this was only the beginning. The return flight from Hawaii felt nothing like the joyful trip Ethan had imagined. Instead of holding hands and whispering about their future, he and Bella sat in silence, a gulf of disappointment between them. Bella's designer sunglasses hit her eyes, but the way she scrolled through her phone with sharp, restless movements betrayed her anger. Ethan tried to tell himself things would smooth over once they were back in Florida, once Bella returned to the comfort of her parents' mansion. But the moment they stepped off the plane, reality hit harder than the humid Florida air. Bella's parents were waiting near the arrivals gate, their expressions carved in stone. Her father barely glanced at Ethan before pulling Bella aside. The words weren't loud, but they were cutting, each one slicing deeper than the last. Ethan caught fragments carried by the crowd's murmur, phrases like living off his mother, embarrassment, and unfit for our family. Bella's cheeks flushed red, not with passion, but with shame. She tried to defend herself, her voice trembling, but her mother's hand on her shoulder silenced her. Then, as if the world had slowed down, Ethan watched Bella slip off the wedding band she had worn for barely a week. Her father's hand extended toward her, steady and expectant. She dropped the ring into his palm and turned her gaze back to Ethan for one last moment. Her voice was quiet, but every word landed like a hammer. "I can't do this. I thought you were different, but you're just empty." And just like that, she walked away, the click of her heels echoing across the polished airport floor. Ethan stood frozen, luggage at his feet, the noise of travelers rushing past blurring into white noise. The security guards looked on. The families reuniting nearby carried on with their joy. But for Ethan, the world had gone silent. He tried calling out, his throat dry, but Bella never turned back. Within minutes, she disappeared behind the glass doors, swallowed by the black car waiting outside. Ethan remained alone at the baggage claim, his chest tightening with a dread he had never known before. The ring's absence on her hand marked not only the end of his marriage, but the collapse of the carefully built image he had clung to. In that hollow moment, Ethan realized that the wealth, the prestige, the so-called future he thought he secured had vanished in a blink. What he didn't yet understand was that this was only the beginning of his fall. When Ethan returned to Miami, the city no longer welcomed him with open arms. The sleek condo overlooking the bay, once his pride, now came with a stack of unpaid rent notices taped to the door. Without his mother quietly covering the bills, reality hit him in the most brutal way. The landlord's voice on the phone was cold and firm. Pay within 10 days or leave. Ethan stared at the paper in his hand, the reflection in the glass window behind it showing a man he barely recognized. At work, things unraveled even faster. His boss called him into the office, not to congratulate him on his wedding, but to hand him a letter of suspension. The whispers had spread quickly. Clients had heard about the honeymoon fiasco in Hawaii, the declined credit cards, the public humiliation. In the industry of luxury travel and image management, reputation was currency,
and Ethan's had plummeted to nothing. By the end of the week, his position was quietly given to someone else. Friends he once took out on his yacht or entertained with champagne at rooftop bars suddenly stopped answering his calls. Messages were left on read, invitations ignored. When he did bump into one of them on the street, the smile was forced, the conversation short, and the goodbye too quick. Ethan had become a liability, a reminder of how fast fortunes could vanish. Desperation pushed him to sell everything he could. The silver-gray sports car that once roared along Ocean Drive was hauled away by a buyer who barely looked at him. The Rolex on his wrist, a gift to himself after his first big promotion, was pawned for a fraction of its worth. The designer suits that made him feel untouchable were lined up at a second-hand boutique, waiting for strangers to claim them. Each sale felt like peeling away another layer of the man he had pretended to be. Nights grew lonelier. His apartment echoed with emptiness, and meals turned from fine dining to instant noodles. He scrolled through photos of his wedding on his phone, not to smile, but to torture himself. Bella's face, once full of promise, now looked like a reminder of everything he had lost. For the first time in his life, Ethan understood the kind of silence his mother had lived with all those years, the silence of sacrifice, of swallowing pain without complaint. But unlike her, he was not enduring it with strength. He was breaking under it, piece by fragile piece. And as his world crumbled, one question echoed louder than the rest. Without the image, without the money, without the friends, who was he now? Ethan's days began before sunrise now. No more alarm clocks buzzing in a high-rise apartment with ocean views. Instead, he woke to the sound of thin walls and neighbors coughing in the hallway of a cheap rented room. The air smelled of old paint and damp carpet, but it was all he could afford. Work was no longer about strategy meetings and luxury campaigns. He found himself lifting crates in the back of a warehouse, the weight pressing down on his shoulders until his arms shook. Later, he picked up shifts at a diner, washing dishes until his fingers wrinkled and his back ached from leaning over sinks. Each shift paid little, but it was honest work, the kind of work he once dismissed without thought. Now it was the only thing keeping him fed. At first, bitterness burned inside him. He cursed his luck, cursed Bella, even cursed his mother for pulling the rug out from under him. But as the weeks passed, something began to change. He started noticing the quiet dignity of the people around him. The old cook at the diner who whistled while flipping burgers. The single mother folding napkins while keeping an eye on her daughter doing homework in the corner booth. None of them had luxury, but all of them carried a strength he had never known. One night, after a long shift, Ethan walked past his old neighborhood in Savannah. He hadn't been back in years, but his feet carried him there as if drawn by memory. Through the dim glow of a window, he saw his mother, Maggie, bent over her sewing machine. Her hands moved steadily, stitching clothes for children in need. A group of kids huddled nearby, some barefoot, waiting for the warmth of her finished work. Ethan froze in the shadows, watching. Suddenly, the past crashed back like a wave. He was a boy again, clinging to her hand as the storm ripped their house apart. He remembered her body shielding him when the roof caved in, her back pressed against the door as the flood surged. And that scar on her shoulder, the one she never spoke about, came alive in his memory. It was not just a mark. It was proof of her love, proof that she had chosen his life over her own. His chest tightened, his throat burned, and for the first time in years, tears blurred his vision. He realized he had not just lost money or status, he had lost sight of the very person who had given him everything. That night, Ethan made a choice. He would not run from his shame anymore.
He would knock on her door, face her, and beg for forgiveness. Ethan stood at the edge of the porch, his knuckles hovering over the wooden door that had once been the gateway to his childhood. For a long moment, he could not bring himself to knock. Shame pressed against his chest like a weight. But the sight of his mother hunched over that sewing machine would not leave his mind. Finally, with a deep breath, he raised his hand and tapped. The door creaked open, and there she was, Maggie Carter. Her hair a little grayer, her face etched with years of work and worry, yet her eyes still carried the same light that once guided him through storms. For a second, neither of them spoke. Ethan's throat closed, and all the carefully rehearsed words vanished. He simply fell to his knees. "Mom," he whispered, his voice breaking, "I'm sorry for everything, for forgetting what you sacrificed, for turning my back on you." Maggie's eyes filled with tears, but she did not speak. She only reached out, her trembling hand brushing against his cheek. Ethan lifted her wrist gently, his gaze falling on the scar that had marked her skin since the night of the hurricane. He traced it with his fingers, as if seeing it for the first time. "This," he said, choking on the words, "this is your Medal of Honor. You gave me life when the storm tried to take it, and I called you a burden." His voice cracked as he lowered his head. "I don't deserve your forgiveness." Maggie bent down, her arms wrapping around him in a fierce embrace. She pulled him against her chest, the same chest that had shielded him from the flood years ago. "You are my son," she whispered, her voice steady, though her tears streamed freely. "Nothing could ever take that away. Not storms, not distance, not even your mistakes." Ethan sobbed against her shoulder, the sound raw and unguarded. After a long silence, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled envelope. Inside was the first paycheck he had earned from his shifts at the diner and the warehouse. The bills were worn, but he held them out with both hands. "Please," he said, his voice low but determined, "let me give something back. It's not much, but it's a start. I owe you more than I can ever repay." Maggie shook her head and gently closed his hands around the money. "I never raised you for repayment. I raised you to live, to learn, and to love. That is all I ever wanted." Ethan could not answer. He only clung to her, as though afraid she might slip away again. And in that quiet, under the dim light of the old house, a broken bond was mended. The storm had taken so much from them, but it had never taken her love. That, Ethan realized, was the greatest wealth he had ever known.